Now, one of the questions that comes up is if a hacker or attacker discovers a vulnerability in a system or in software or an application, how do they take advantage of it? What can they do to actually use the vulnerability to their advantage? And the answer is the attacker is going to use some type of an exploit. An exploit is a tool or a system or a method that takes advantage of and compromises the system based on the existing vulnerability. So in this video, I'd like to provide some network-based vulnerabilities and give you some examples of exploits that take advantage of those vulnerabilities. So we mentioned that vulnerabilities could come from a variety of sources. A bug in software or hardware, or a flaw in that software or hardware, or it could just be bad or lacking configuration, or a legacy system, or human intervention, or it could just be the default way that the network operates, and then that's a vulnerability that can be exploited using the correct tools. So let's use some examples of vulnerabilities, and then we'll take a look at some exploits that could take advantage of these vulnerabilities. One of those would be trusting ARP messages. Now, in a network, if somebody asks for a layer 2 mapping for a layer 3 address, we use address resolution protocol, but by default, there's no checking to verify that somebody isn't lying about their layer 2 address. So an attacker could inject erroneous information and train a client that, hey, your default gateway, it's really my MAC address. So the switch would then forward all the traffic to the attacker instead of the default gateway. Or a switch, as it's building its MAC address tables, is looking at source MAC addresses, believes by default all the source MAC addresses that come in. So if an attacker is sitting on one port and simply flooding the bejeebers and is sending in thousands of frames with bogus made up source MAC addresses, is trying to consume all the address space that the switch has in the attempt to then eavesdrop on all the traffic going through the switch. So this vulnerability, this believing every source MAC address without any kind of limit, can be leveraged by an attacker who's aware that that's how a switch operates by default. Or if we discovered that a Cisco router or a Cisco switch, as it gets CDP messages, is going to process those, what happens if we send a few hundred or a few thousand CDP messages, all claiming to be from different devices, and we could cause a denial of service attack, just keeping the switch or router so darn busy in trying to process all the CDP messages. Another challenge is that by default, there's no restrictions on DHCP server messages. So someone could inadvertently or maliciously plug in their own DHCP server and start handing out bogus or incorrect IP address information as far as the ranges, and also possibly acting as a man in the middle by directing traffic via default gateway to the hacker system before that traffic is then rerouted out the real default gateway. So the key here is that for these existing vulnerabilities, the attacker is going to use exploits that take advantage of those vulnerabilities, of those weaknesses in the system. And here's what I thought would be fun for you and I to do. Let me demo just a few of these so you can see how real they are, and then we'll take a look in a subsequent video about countermeasures on what we could do to protect our networks. And I also want to point out that we would never want to test or try these types of compromises or exploits on a network without explicit permission, because it's very likely we could bring down the network by using these exploits against these existing known vulnerabilities. So here on this Kali Linux box, let's bring up a command prompt. And if we want to do ARP spoofing on this Kali Linux box, we just do ARP SPOOF. That's one of the many exploit tools for ARP spoofing on a Kali Linux box. And then we'll just put in the IP address of the default gateway, which is, let me take a look, ifconfig. So this computer's on the 10.16.20 network. The default gateway is at .1, so we can type in ARP spoof space and then the IP address of the default gateway, which is 10.16.20.1, and press enter. And it's just sending out a broadcast saying, hey, this IP address 10.16.20.1 is at this layer 2 address, which happens to be the layer 2 address of the Kali Linux box. So it's lying to the whole network about what the layer 2 address is of the real default gateway. So this is an example of an exploit that's leveraging or taking advantage of the vulnerability. The vulnerability in this case is the fact that ARP doesn't do any validation checking by default. Another exploit would be flooding the MAC address table on a layer 2 switch so they just can't remember where all the real layer 2 addresses are and starts flooding everything. So that also can be done right here through a Kali Linux box with a tool called MACoff. So if we go to the switch and use the command show MAC address table count, it'll show us that we have a pretty low number of MAC addresses in the 3 VLANs that it has. But if we go to our Kali Linux box and we use the command MACOF and press enter, it's just going to flood thousands, and I'll just stop it here, Control C. It's going to flood lots and lots of frames into the network, lying and making up source MAC addresses for each one. So if we go back to the switch, and I only ran this for just a few seconds, hit the up arrow key, and do the show MAC address table again, check this out. In fact, let me go ahead and do a show MAC address table count. And just in that few seconds, it now knows about 3,435 dynamically learned MAC addresses. So the attacker could just leave a tool like that running to consume all of the addressable memory inside the layer 2 switch. And then once the switch no longer knows how to forward frames to real hosts, it would start flooding them out all ports, which would allow the attacker to then eavesdrop. Another technique would be CDP flooding. So if we do a show CDP neighbor and take a look at who we have, currently it's got one neighbor of router 3, but if we go back to our attack machine and we run the exploit for CDP flooding, and here on the Kali Linux box, we can use a tool called Yersinia, and we'll click OK to that, and then we'll click on Launch Attack, and then we'll specify that we want to do a CDP flood attack, and click on OK. And it's running. Here's the number of packets up here that it's currently doing. Back here on the switch, if we hit the up arrow key and show CDP neighbors again, look at this. Now it knows about all these CDP entries, which are all lies. They're all just made up. So if the attacker just left that running, this switch would now be consumed by just processing CDP messages and updating his table, and do a show process CPU space, and let's go ahead and do sorted. Press enter. Look at this, the past 5 seconds, 93%. We were just consuming tons and tons of resources on the switch just by the switch having to process all those CDP messages. So as a result of our time together in this video, we've now identified that if there's a vulnerability, regardless of how that vulnerability got there, the tools or mechanisms that the attacker would use to compromise and take advantage of us because of that vulnerability, that's referred to as an exploit. So thanks for joining me in this video. I'll see you in the next one. Meanwhile, I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.